On the night of May 31st, 2009, Air France Flight 447 took off from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, bound for Paris, France. It was a routine transatlantic flight until just hours after departure, the aircraft vanished from radar over the Atlantic Ocean. For days, the world watched as search teams scoured the oceans for wreckage. When the Airbus A330 was finally found, it was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. The crash claimed the lives of all 228 people on board and raised questions about modern aviation safety. How could an experienced crew flying a technologically advanced aircraft end up in such a disastrous situation? What were the critical factors that led to the crash of Air France Flight 447? Today, we explore the flight files of Air France Flight 447. Hello everyone and welcome to the Flight Files. I'm your host Dan, and today we are taking a look into Air France Flight 447. Before I get into the episode, if you enjoy the podcast and want to see more, head on over to theflightfiles.com and follow @theflightfiles on social media. Let's jump in. Flight 447 was an Airbus A330 and had only been in service for 5 years. By the time of the incident, it had logged over 18,000 flight hours across 2,500 flights, with no major mechanical issues reported, and its last routine maintenance completed 2 months before the crash. The A330 was considered fully airworthy. For the passengers and crew, there was no reason to suspect that anything was amiss as they prepared for an overnight journey from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. Flight 447 was part of Air France's regular long-haul service between South America and Europe. On May 31st, 2009, it departed from Rio de Janeiro's Galeão International Airport at 7:29 p.m. local time. On board were 216 passengers from 32 different countries, along with 12 crew members. The crew consisted of 3 highly trained pilots: Captain Marc Dubois, First Officer David Robert, and First Officer Pierre-Cédric Bonin. Captain Dubois, 58, was a seasoned pilot with over 11,000 hours of flight experience, including extensive time on the Airbus A330. First Officer Robert, aged 37, was also experienced with 6,500 flight hours. The youngest of the crew, First Officer Bonin, aged 32, had 2,900 flight hours, but despite his relative inexperience, he had successfully completed training on the A330. As was common practice for long-haul flights, the pilots took turns resting during the flight, with one remaining in control while the others rested in designated crew rest areas. The flight was scheduled to last approximately 11 hours, covering over 5,500 miles from Rio to Paris. Its flight path would take it across the Atlantic Ocean, passing through the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or the ITCZ, a region notorious for its volatile weather. The ITCZ is a belt of thunderstorms and unpredictable winds that forms near the equator, where the northeast and southeast trade winds meet. Crossing this zone was a routine part of transatlantic flights, and it was not unusual for pilots to encounter turbulence or need to adjust their altitude to avoid storm cells. The Airbus A330 was equipped with advanced radar systems to detect weather patterns, and pilots were trained to deviate from storms or navigate through turbulent areas as necessary. However, the flight into the ITCZ is particularly challenging during the nighttime, when storm cells are harder to detect visually and the risk of ice forming on the aircraft increases. As Flight 447 cruised at 35,000 feet, the crew entered the ITCZ, where the weather was known to be unstable that night. At this point, the autopilot system was engaged, keeping the aircraft on its course as it approached an area of heavy thunderstorms. Despite the turbulent weather ahead, the crew remained confident in the capabilities of both the aircraft and the technology on board. Modern planes like the A330 are built to handle rough weather, and there was no reason for the crew to expect anything other than a routine flight through the stormy region. Nevertheless, the crew would soon face a sequence of events that would overwhelm even the advanced systems of the A330, leading to a tragic loss of control over the Atlantic. As Flight 447 prepared to cross into the stormy region, the combination of challenging weather, technical failures, and human factors would prove to be disastrous. What started as a transatlantic flight would soon become one of the most puzzling and devastating crashes in modern aviation history. At 1:49 a.m. UTC, Air France Flight 447 was cruising at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, well into its transatlantic journey. The aircraft was approaching an area of intense thunderstorms with the Intertropical Conversion Zone, or the ITCZ, where the pilots knew they would likely encounter turbulence. As the plane entered the storm, the crew reported experiencing light turbulence, but nothing out of the ordinary. Captain Marc Dubois, having completed his shift at the controls, left the cockpit for his scheduled rest, leaving First Officer Pierre-Cedric Bonin and First Officer David Robert in command. Now, to preface, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing those names right, so apologies if I'm not. I'm assuming how they're pronounced. At 2:10 a.m. UTC, as the aircraft approached the heart of the storm, the weather conditions began to deteriorate. Outside temperatures dropped, and the plane encountered icing conditions, which caused ice to accumulate on the aircraft's pitot tubes, critical instruments that measure airspeed. These pitot tubes are designed to provide real-time data to the flight control systems, allowing the autopilot to manage the aircraft's speed, altitude, and heading. However, with ice blocking the pitot tubes, the airspeed readings became unreliable, triggering the autopilot to disengage. Suddenly, the aircraft's flight control system shifted from automated mode to manual control, with the pilots now responsible for flying the aircraft by hand. In normal conditions, this would not have been an issue, but the loss of reliable airspeed data made manual flying far more complex. The A330's sophisticated fly-by-wire system, which relies on accurate sensor input, was unable to provide reliable feedback to the pilots. Without a clear understanding of their speed, the crew had to rely on instinct and training to control the aircraft. This wasn't the first time the pitot tubes on the Airbus A330 had malfunctioned in icing conditions. In fact, similar incidents had been reported by other airlines, raising questions about whether these sensors were properly suited for flight in extreme weather. After the crash, this design flaw would become a focal point in the investigation. In the confusion following the autopilot's disengagement, First Officer Bonin, the least experienced of the three pilots, took control of the aircraft. In response to the turbulence and the sudden loss of automated systems, Bonin pulled back on the control stick, pitching the nose of the aircraft upward in an attempt to gain altitude. This decision, however, would prove to be the first in a series of fatal errors. As Bonin pitched the nose up, the aircraft began to climb, but without sufficient airspeed, it was at risk of stalling. A stall occurs when the angle of attack, the angle between the aircraft's wings and the oncoming airflow, becomes too steep, causing a loss of lift. Although the aircraft's stall warning system briefly activated, indicating that the plane was nearing a stall, the warning ceased when the unreliable airspeed data caused the system to malfunction. This created a dangerous situation in which the pilots were unaware that the aircraft was on the verge of stalling. Throughout this critical period, there was a breakdown in communication between the pilots. Bonin, in command of the aircraft, did not clearly communicate his actions or intentions to his colleagues. First Officer Robert, the more experienced of the two, was not immediately aware of Bonin's decision to pitch the nose upward. When the stall warning sounded, the crew seemed uncertain about the situation they were facing, with conflicting instrument readings and warnings further clouding their judgment. Over the next several minutes, the situation worsened. The aircraft continued to climb to 38,000 feet, far above its optimal cruising altitude, all while losing forward speed. At 2:11 a.m. UTC, the aircraft reached its maximum altitude, and then the inevitable occurred. The A330 stalled. In a stalled state, the aircraft's wings could no longer generate the necessary lift to keep it airborne. The plane began to descend rapidly, falling at a rate of 10,000 feet per minute, and at this point they were at around 38,000 feet, so realistically they had about 4 minutes before they hit the ground, or the ocean underneath them. Despite the seriousness of the situation, the flight crew did not immediately recognize that the aircraft had stalled. The chaotic environment in the cockpit, compounded by the lack of accurate airspeed data and conflicting warnings from the flight control system, left the pilots confused and unsure how to recover. First Officer Robert, now realizing the gravity of the situation, attempted to regain control by taking over from Bonin, but the situation had already deteriorated beyond immediate recovery. The nose remained pitched upwards as the plane continued to fall, and the crew's attempts to lower the nose and increase airspeed were ineffective. A critical element during these minutes was the psychological pressure on the pilots. The combination of physical stress from the turbulent conditions and mental overload from the malfunctioning instruments likely impaired their ability to respond appropriately. In high-stress situations, even experienced pilots can struggle to make effective decisions, and the less experienced Bonin's instinct to pull the nose up was a natural but counterproductive response to the crisis. As the aircraft plunged towards the ocean, Captain Dubois re-entered the cockpit, but by then it was too late. With the plane in a fully developed stall and falling rapidly, there was little that could be done to regain control. The A330 descended into the Atlantic Ocean at a steep angle, hitting the water at approximately 2:14 a.m. UTC. In just over 3 minutes, Air France Flight 447 had descended from 38,000 feet to sea level, resulting in the deaths of all 228 people on board. The crash site, located in one of the deepest parts of the Atlantic Ocean, presented a significant challenge for search and rescue teams. It would take several days to locate debris from the aircraft and years to fully recover the wreckage from the ocean floor. The investigation into the crash of Air France Flight 447 would become one of the most complex and prolonged efforts in aviation history, spanning over 2 years and involving cutting-edge technology to recover the aircraft from the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. The French Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety led the investigation, with assistance from Airbus, Air France, and international aviation experts. The first challenge investigators faced was locating the wreckage. Flight 447 had disappeared over the Atlantic, and the crash occurred in a remote part of the ocean, with depths reaching up to 13,000 feet. Search teams initially located floating debris, including a section of the aircraft's tail, along with some bodies and personal belongings. But the bulk of the wreckage, including the crucial flight data and cockpit voice recorders, remained elusive. For 2 years, investigators were left with limited physical evidence, hampering their ability to understand exactly what had caused the crash. It wasn't until April 2011 that remotely operated underwater vehicles were able to locate the main wreckage on the ocean floor. The flight data and cockpit voice recorders, often referred to as the black boxes, were recovered soon after, providing the key pieces of evidence needed to unravel the mystery of Flight 447. The data retrieved from the recorders painted a clearer picture of the final moments of the flight, including the technical malfunctions and human errors that led to the disaster. The BEA's final report, released in 2012, identified multiple contributing factors to the crash, beginning with the failure of the aircraft's pitot tubes. The blockage of these tubes due to ice crystals caused the autopilot to disengage and deprive the pilots of reliable airspeed information. Without this crucial data, the pilots were left in a highly stressful situation, relying on their manual flying skills and judgment. The investigation revealed that the flight crew's response to the loss of airspeed data was flawed. First Officer Bonin's decision to pull back on the control stick, causing the aircraft to pitch upward and ultimately stall, was a critical error. The BEA noted that Bonin's actions were inconsistent with standard recovery procedures, which call for lowering the nose to regain airspeed when faced with a potential stall. The report also highlighted the lack of effective communication between the pilots during the emergency, as well as the failure of the more experienced First Officer Robert to intervene sooner. One of the most significant findings of the investigation was the role that human factors played in the crash. The BEA emphasized that the crew was likely overwhelmed by the confusing and conflicting information presented by the aircraft's instruments. The loss of airspeed data, combined with the malfunctioning stall warning system, created a scenario in which the pilots were unable to accurately assess the state of the aircraft. Furthermore, the lack of proper stall recovery training for high-altitude scenarios contributed to the crew's inability to recover from the stall in time. The report also criticized the design of the Airbus A330's flight control systems, particularly the reliance on pitot tubes that were susceptible to icing. While the pitot tubes were manufactured by Thales, an aerospace technology company, and were compliant with industry standards at the time, the investigation brought to light the need for more robust sensors capable of withstanding extreme weather conditions. Following the crash, Airbus and other manufacturers began replacing older pitot tubes models with upgraded versions less prone to icing. The BEA's finding led to several key safety recommendations aimed at preventing similar accidents in the future. Among these were calls for improved pilot training, particularly in manual flying skills and stall recovery techniques. The investigation revealed that modern pilots, who rely heavily on automated systems, often lacked the experience and confidence needed to handle manual flying during critical emergencies. The crash of Flight 447 underscored the importance of ensuring that pilots are well prepared to manage high altitude stalls and other unusual flight conditions, even when the automated systems fail. In response to the report, Air France implemented new training protocols for its pilots, focusing on manual flying skills and stall recovery. Airbus also made changes to the design of its aircraft, incorporating more advanced pitot tubes and improving flight control system redundancy. Additionally, the International Civil Aviation Organization, or the ICAO, introduced new standards for pilot training, emphasizing the need for more realistic stall recovery scenarios during simulator sessions. Beyond the technical and procedural changes, the crash of Flight 447 also sparked a broader conversation about the relationship between pilots and automation in modern aviation. The increased reliance on automated systems, while improving overall safety, has also led to concerns about automation dependency, where pilots become overly reliant on technology and lose the ability to effectively manage an aircraft in manual mode. The incident highlighted the need for a balance between automation and human control, with pilots maintaining the skills necessary to take over when the systems fail. The recovery of the wreckage and the subsequent investigation brought closure to the families of the victim, many of whom had endured years of uncertainty. In memory of the 228 people who lost their lives, a memorial was established in Brazil, and a second memorial was erected in Paris, where many of the passengers had been bound. The crash of Air France Flight 447 was not only a tragedy in terms of the lives lost, but also a wake-up call for the aviation industry, revealing a complex relationship between technology, human factors, and training. The incident raised pressing questions about pilot reliance on automated systems, the adequacy of training for handling rare but critical scenarios, and the limitations of aircraft design in extreme conditions. At the heart of the Flight 447 crash was the interaction between humans and automation. Modern commercial aircraft like the Airbus A330 are equipped with highly sophisticated autopilot systems that handle most aspects of flight, from takeoff to cruising to landing. These systems have dramatically improved the overall safety of air travel, reducing pilot workload and minimizing the chance of human error. However, as the crash of Flight 447 demonstrated, the reliance on automation also comes with significant risks, particularly when automation fails in critical moments, leaving pilots to take manual control in high-stress situations. One of the key lessons from the disaster was the concept of automation complacency. Many pilots today spend the majority of their flight monitoring systems rather than directly flying the aircraft. While this approach works well under normal conditions, it can lead to a dangerous gap in manual flying skills. In the case of Flight 447, the autopilot disengaged due to a faulty airspeed reading from the ice-covered pitot tubes, forcing the pilots to take manual control at a moment's notice. The investigation into the crash also highlighted deficiencies in pilot training, specifically regarding high-altitude stalls. Traditional training scenarios focus on a stall recovery at lower altitudes, where the dynamics are different and pilots have more time to react. The BEA's report made it clear that pilots needed more comprehensive training in high-altitude stall recovery, where time is of the essence and incorrect responses can lead to disaster. The failure of the crew to recognize and recover from the stall was a direct consequence of this training gap. In addition to training, the crash of Flight 447 sparked a re-evaluation of how human factors such as stress and decision-making play a role in aviation safety. The chaotic environment in the cockpit with conflicting instrument readings and multiple warnings overwhelmed the pilots. Psychological studies conducted after the crash indicated that stress likely impaired the crew's cognitive abilities, leading to errors in judgment and delayed responses. In high-stress scenarios, the brain's ability to process information is often compromised, causing individuals to default to instinctive actions, such as Bunning's instinct to pull back on the controls, despite the fact that this response exacerbated the stall. This raised important questions about how pilots are trained to manage stress and make effective decisions under pressure. It has also underscored the importance of cockpit resource management, CRM, where communication and teamwork between crew members are vital. The failure of the more experienced First Officer Robert to intervene sooner and the lack of clear communication between the two pilots were key contributors to the disaster. Modern CRM practices emphasize clear communication, shared decision-making, and the ability of any crew member, regardless of rank, to speak up during an emergency. The Flight 447 crash reinforced the need for CRM training to be continually improved and emphasized in flight training programs. Beyond the human factors, the crash also revealed vulnerabilities in the design of certain aircraft systems. The pitot tubes, responsible for providing accurate airspeed readings, had a history of malfunctioning in icy conditions. Though the specific model used on the Airbus A330 was compliant with regulations at the time, the investigation into the flight prompted manufacturers to adopt more robust sensors that could better withstand extreme weather. The technical flaw, which may seem minor, ultimately contributed to the sequence of events that led to the crash. In the broader context, the crash of Flight 447 reignited debates about the role of automation in aviation. While automated systems have undeniably made flying safer, there is an ongoing conversation about finding the right balance between human control and machine control. In the years following the disaster, the aviation industry has continued to evolve, with lessons learned from Flight 447 contributing to a safer flying experience for passengers and crew alike. The crash of Air France Flight 447 stands as a reminder of the complexity and challenges of modern aviation. It revealed vulnerabilities in how pilots interact with advanced automation and highlighted the critical importance of maintaining manual flying skills, even in a highly automated cockpit. In the years since the crash, both Air France and the broader aviation industry have worked hard to address the lessons learned from Flight 447. Today, pilots undergo more rigorous training for high-altitude stalls, aircraft are equipped with more reliable sensors, and the importance of clear communication in the cockpit is emphasized more than ever. Thank you for joining me as we explored the flight files of Air France Flight 447. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform to stay updated on future episodes as we continue to explore the flight files of the aviation industry.